Yes, Bill, let's begin by talking about what, in your opinion, is distinctive about the Vietnam War. What brought about U.S. involvement in this ill-fated adventure?
The most distinctive feature of the Vietnam War is that it was the first war in modern times to be fought from a managerial business perspective. During World War II, U.S. industry made a massive contribution to the war effort, and American military men and political leaders fully appreciated that effort. During World War II, the military partially adopted a business model of organization for their supply operation. After World War II, they began to think of combat as also a production process. The officer corps were seen not as gladiator heroes who were leading men in combat, but as war managers. In turn, the enlisted men were no longer the citizens of a nation, but they were workers. Managers and workers worked on a production line to produce deaths, and the product then was enemy body counts. So just as American society's strength, supposedly, was high technology, capital-intensive business, so too would we fight wars as high technology, capital-intensive warfare, and we would literally drive the other side bankrupt. So it's this production model of war, or what I call techno-war, that distinguishes at a primary structural level Vietnam from other warfare.
So then in this way, we couldn't lose because we were fighting a small, underdeveloped, untechnical third world country with peasants, basically.
Exactly. From an American perspective, if the only thing that counts in warfare is technology and economics, both in your economy and how you translate your economy into your military, then it was impossible for us to lose. It was theoretically impossible for an underdeveloped peasant economy to beat the United States. It just couldn't happen. Therefore, whenever we ran into a problem in 54 or 60 or 64, at every time the U.S. was defeated, we always thought that if we escalated to the next highest level, we would win. It's a closed system.
And Bill, why was Vietnam chosen as the site for the first techno-war?
There's no historical reason for Vietnam. In other words, really Vietnam as a country, as a people, as a culture, didn't really matter to the Americans. So there was nothing about the country per se to make us fight there. It was simply the time when this whole apparatus of warfare was developing vis-a-vis the time when the situation in Vietnam was deteriorating from an American perspective. Techno-war, or this production model of war, got its big push in the 50s. Because after World War II, when we had the hydrogen bomb or the atomic bomb, and then later the hydrogen bomb, and the Russians didn't, it seemed clear to us that our mastery of the world was just unsurpassed and we could not be challenged. But when the Russians had the bomb, we were in a situation of potentially mutual destruction, where they could destroy our industrial apparatus, then this made the Americans feel impotent. And so the question came is, how can we develop a form of warfare to exercise our power in the world without threatening nuclear war? And the idea, developed by Dr. Henry Kissinger, who at the time was a professor at political science at Harvard, was what's called limited war. And the idea was, because our economy was so big and powerful, we could have guns and butter. Butter and TVs and popcorn and drive-ins and hula hoops for the Americans at home, and limited war for an indefinite period of time in the third world. And because we were so much richer, we would just drive the other side bankrupt.
And it was a period where certain guerrilla movements, certain national liberation movements were emerging. We saw the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and there were third world revolutionary movements throughout Latin America, Africa, South
The French and British empires were deteriorating worldwide. Certainly, and Vietnam's a classic case of that. Vietnam had been a French colony that went through a long process of revolt. So Vietnam was just simply, it was ready. We had our theory for limited war, and we had our apparatus in place at the time Vietnam well, by the time the French had been thrown out.
Can you give us a brief history of Vietnam and their struggle, first against the Chinese and then the French, etc., leading up to American intervention?
Certainly, the word Vietnam originally, it means Southern Kingdom of the Viet, and it was a part of China that, well, didn't really break off. It's like Chinese immigrated there, and they formed a racially distinct group and tried to claim independence. Chinese emperors would invade Vietnam, hold the country for several hundred years. Vietnamese guerrilla fighters would throw the Chinese out. The Chinese would then invade and hold it for another 50, 100 years. Then the Vietnamese would throw them out and hold on for 50 years. This struggle between Vietnam and China for Vietnamese independence went on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Finally, by the time the Vietnamese had finally defeated China, they were weak, though. But this is the time when the West was expanding, and France was looking for a way to get to China for the spice trade and so on, and they ended up taking Vietnam. So France took Vietnam as a colony in the 1890s. Vietnamese fought off and on against the French from the 1890s on up. Oh, they just kept on fighting. But then in World War II, the communists, especially headed by Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap and Lê Đức Thọ, organized better. They fought against the Japanese, and then after declared their independence in '45, and ironically, American intelligence operatives supported that effort extensively.
And Ho Chi Minh, as I understand it, looked at that time to the United States as a model to develop his country, not to the Soviet Union.
His position was that he had paid off whatever he felt he ideologically owed to the Soviet Union, and that he was a free agent, he was not getting any assistance, and that the America, with the Declaration of Independence and with its stated anti-imperialist policy, was a far better possible ally.
And it was a model of democracy for him, too, and at that time he was a nationalist and a Democrat to some extent.
Certainly a nationalist. How much a Democrat? I'm not. I wouldn't. He was pretty.
He
much
at least paid lip service to the democratic values and the anti-imperialist.
But certainly a nationalist.
Yeah. Well, then the Vietnamese defeated the French
in '54 after 8 years of extensive warfare, extensive guerrilla warfare. And it's important for us to understand the war in Vietnam was one country. It had been tentatively divided into 3 administrative zones by the French, but warfare was going on in all 3. When the war ended in '54, the country looked like a checkerboard. Some French in the north, some Vietnamese or Viet Minh in the north. Some French cities held in the south, other areas held by the Vietnamese communists. North and South Vietnam didn't exist. It was only a checkerboard. But then, at the Geneva peace talks in 1954, there was a land swap. Vietnamese forces moved north, French consolidated their forces in the south. A line was drawn, a provisional administrative boundary, not a national boundary, not a political boundary, an administrative zone boundary. And the idea was the country would be divided for 2 years and there would be international elections in '56. There were no such elections. The United States moved in. But what's important to understand, this idea of North Vietnam as a separate country that invaded South Vietnam is wrong. There was no North and South Vietnam as 2 separate countries. That was it was a checkerboard at the end of '54 that got changed.
And what happened in the South to begin the resistance struggle?
In '54, the Viet Cong in the South were told to put down their guns and that they were going to engage in political struggle for 2 years in preparation for the '56 elections. That became extremely dangerous. Diem, the man the Americans put in power, immediately went after and hunted down most of the communists, leftists, Democrats, nationalists. In other words, Diem and his family ruled Vietnam pretty much as a dictatorship. And finally, by the late '50s, the local communist and guerrilla and socialist and democratic apparatus was taking casualties so badly that they had to renew the armed struggle to survive. And so simply then the southern cadres put pressure on the North, on the Communist Party, to reopen the military front and have a joint political and military strategy as opposed to simply trying to wait for international intervention or by the United Nations or something. So that's the origin of resistance.